You don't belong here." The words echoed through the air, thick with judgment. The officer's grip was tight on Jessica's wrist, his fingers cold against her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her gaze never wavered. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the busy street. But for Jessica Carter, it felt as though the world had narrowed down to a single moment. A moment of humiliation, of injustice. "What did I do wrong?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger and hurt simmering just beneath the surface. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" Officer Jake Thompson sneered, ignoring her plea, his eyes filled with disdain. The crowd around them watched in silence, some glancing nervously at each other, others turning their backs. No one stepped forward to help, to speak up. Just another black woman being wronged in broad daylight, another face in the crowd. Jessica stood there, her hands trembling slightly, but her head held high. She refused to let them see her break. Her father, a man who had taught her the meaning of true strength, would have been proud of how she stood firm, even in the face of such blatant racism. She wasn't just any woman on the street. She was someone with a history of resilience, of fighting for what was right. But today, it wasn't enough. Today, she was just another black woman at the mercy of a corrupt system. Officer Thompson continued to tighten his grip, dragging her toward the police car, ignoring her protests, dismissing her dignity with every step. The humiliation stung, but it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. This was just the beginning. As the officer shoved her into the back of the squad car, Jessica's thoughts raced. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. There had to be something she could do, something that would change the course of this moment, this entire day. And then, with a calmness that shocked even her, she pulled out her phone from her bag. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Thompson rolled his eyes, clearly unconcerned. "Go ahead," he muttered, assuming she was just trying to make her last-ditch effort to avoid the consequences. But Jessica wasn't calling anyone for pity. She wasn't calling for help in the way he thought. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was making a call that would turn this entire situation upside down. She dialed her brother's number. David Carter, U.S. Attorney General. He'd always been her rock, her protector, her guide. A man who had fought his whole life against the injustice that now lay before her. She didn't have to explain anything to him. She didn't need to say a word. The moment he heard her voice, he knew. He understood. "Stay calm, Jess," he said, his voice steady, but she could hear the underlying urgency. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. As the squad car pulled away from the sidewalk, Jessica sat back, her heart still racing, but now with a new sense of hope. She had trusted in her brother's power before, and now she had no doubt that he would deliver her from this moment of injustice. She only had to wait. In the distance, the shadows of the city grew longer as the sun slowly dipped lower, but it didn't matter. The real change was coming. In the next few minutes, everything would shift. Officer Thompson had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea that the woman he had just wrongfully arrested was connected to one of the most powerful men in the country. The officer's arrogance, his dismissal of her, was about to cost him dearly. This wasn't just about an arrest anymore. This was about something bigger, something that would ripple through the system and shake it to its core. Jessica knew that her brother's arrival would not only free her, but also expose the brokenness of the system that had allowed this to happen. A system that turned a blind eye to injustice, that allowed people like Officer Thompson to wield their power with impunity. But not today. Today, the power would shift. Today, Jessica would not be just another victim. She would be the one who brought justice, the one who turned the tables. And as the car raced toward the police station, she felt something new stir within her, a quiet but unshakable confidence. The world was about to see just how wrong they were to underestimate her. I was wrongfully arrested, and no one stepped up to help. I should have known it would be like this. The voices, the whispers, the feeling of being trapped. I had prepared myself for this, but the humiliation still stung. I could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into my wrists, my heart pounding in my chest as the officer's footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway of the station. They hadn't said much to me after the arrest, but the looks, those looks, spoke louder than any words. I had become just another case, just another person of color caught in the system, unnoticed, invisible. But I wasn't going to stay silent. I wasn't going to let this go. Not when my brother, David Carter, was just a phone call away. I held on to that thought as if it was the only thing keeping me grounded. He would fix this. He always fixed things. As I sat there, hands still cuffed behind my back, I replayed the moment I called him. The sound of his calm, reassuring voice on the other end. "Stay calm, Jess. I'm coming." His words were all I needed to hear. In the silence of the holding cell, I could almost hear the wheels of justice turning in the background. I wasn't going to sit here forever. Things were going to change. Just as the anger began to bubble up in my chest, the door to the holding cell swung open. A uniformed officer stepped in, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he motioned for me to stand up. I didn't hesitate. As I stood, the clank of the handcuffs echoed through the room, as if to punctuate the weight of the moment. "Come with me," the officer said curtly, his voice devoid of any emotion. As he led me through the corridors of the station, I couldn't help but notice the cold, sterile atmosphere around me. It felt like a place where justice went to die, where people like me were just numbers in a case file. But I was different. I wasn't just another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. I had the power to change this. I had a brother who was about to turn this whole situation on its head. The officer led me into a small room. The door clicked shut behind us, and I was left alone, staring at the empty table. In front of me, I could feel the weight of the situation settling over me. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the system, about the people who used their power to abuse and manipulate others. They had made a mistake, and they were about to pay for it. I took a deep breath, letting the anger and frustration wash over me for just a moment. And then I wiped it all away. I was in control now. As I sat in the cold, sterile room, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping to hear the words that would end all of this. The message was brief, but it made my heart skip a beat. "I'm here. Wait for me." It was from David. My brother, the U.S. Attorney General, was on his way. I didn't have to say anything. I didn't have to ask for help. He already knew what needed to be done. The thought of him stepping into this room, taking control, made the anger inside me fade away. I knew what was coming. The officer who had wrongfully arrested me, the one who thought he could get away with it, would soon learn just how wrong he was. I wasn't just some random person who could be silenced. I wasn't going to disappear into the system. I had the power to make this right. And when David arrived, it would all change. The clock seemed to tick louder with each passing second, but the wait didn't faze me. I could hear the sounds of the station outside the room, distant voices, footsteps echoing through the hall. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was that I wasn't going to let this injustice stand. And soon, neither would anyone else. The door swung open, and David stepped in. His presence filled the room. He didn't need to say a word. The look on his face told me everything. He was here to make sure the truth came out. To make sure the officer who had humiliated me would be held accountable. To make sure this system didn't win. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm, steady, like the weight of the world didn't rest on his shoulders. But I knew better. I knew he carried the weight of justice with him wherever he went. And now, it was time for the system to face the consequences. The officer who had wrongfully arrested me, the one who had mocked me, had no idea what was about to happen. He had no idea that the woman he had just dismissed was the sister of the most powerful man in the country. And when David spoke, people listened. As we walked out of the room, I felt something shift inside me. The fear, the frustration, the anger, they were all replaced by a quiet confidence. I was no longer just the victim of a wrongful arrest. I was someone who would make sure this never happened again. And soon, Officer Thompson would learn that he had picked the wrong person to mess with. He had picked the wrong black woman to underestimate. The truth was coming for him, and it was coming fast. The hallway felt colder now, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above as Jessica and David walked side by side. The weight of the situation hung heavily between them, but neither of them spoke a word. Jessica kept her eyes ahead, her pulse steady as her brother's presence provided the calm she had been craving. The footsteps of the officers behind them were muffled by the thick silence that filled the air, but she could sense the tension building around them. David had a way of carrying himself, one that commanded respect without saying a word, and Jessica found comfort in that. She knew that everything was about to change. The officer who had wrongly arrested her, who had thought she was just another black woman he could treat like an outsider, would soon see how wrong he was. As they reached the door of the main office, David paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He turned to Jessica, his gaze soft yet filled with a quiet intensity. "Stay close," he said simply, before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was busy, officers bustling about with papers in hand, some on the phone, others in heated discussions. But the moment David stepped in, everything stopped. The voices hushed, the shuffle of feet came to an abrupt halt, and all eyes turned toward him. There was no need for introductions. His reputation preceded him. He was a man who didn't need to announce his presence. Everyone in that room knew who he was. "What's going on here?" David's voice was calm, steady, but it held an undeniable authority. It cut through the silence like a blade, making everyone freeze. Officer Thompson, the one who had arrested Jessica, stood near the desk, his eyes widening as soon as he saw David. His face turned pale, and he quickly straightened up, trying to mask the unease that suddenly gripped him. "Sir, the officer began, but David held up his hand, cutting him off before he could finish. "You made a mistake," David said, his voice unwavering. "You wrongfully arrested my sister, and now you're going to answer for it." The room remained silent, every officer holding their breath. Jessica stood beside David, her hands still cuffed, but her spirit unbroken. The officer's discomfort was palpable, and it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. It wasn't just a matter of a wrongful arrest anymore. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions, and in this room, David Carter was the one who held all the cards. "You will immediately release my sister and ensure that this never happens again," David continued, his tone calm but firm. "And as for your actions, they will be investigated. This will not be swept under the rug." Jessica could see the officer's hands trembling as he tried to gather his thoughts, his arrogance from earlier now completely evaporated. "I didn't know she was your sister," the officer stammered, his voice low, almost pleading. "That doesn't matter," David replied sharply, his eyes never leaving the officers. "The law doesn't change based on who someone is. What you did was wrong, and now you will face the consequences." There was a long pause as the weight of David's words hung in the air. The room was heavy with the realization that the injustice they had witnessed was not going to be ignored. Jessica could feel the anger and frustration from earlier melting away, replaced by a sense of power and control she hadn't felt before. David's calm, unwavering stance was a reminder that justice could be done, even when the system seemed broken. Officer Thompson swallowed hard, his face flushing with embarrassment. He knew this was the beginning of the end for him. The moment he had stepped out of line, he had sealed his fate. "Get her out of those cuffs," David commanded one of the other officers, who quickly stepped forward to comply. Jessica exhaled slowly as the officer unlocked the handcuffs, the pressure on her wrists finally released. She flexed her fingers, the blood returning to them, but she didn't feel relief. She felt empowered. "Thank you," Jessica said quietly, her voice steady as she looked at David. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "This isn't over," he said, his gaze shifting to the other officers in the room. "I want a full investigation into what happened today. No one gets to abuse their power like this." As the officers scrambled to process the situation, David turned to Jessica. "Let's go. This place has nothing left for us." The two of them walked out of the room, Jessica standing tall beside her brother. As they exited the station, the weight of the past few hours began to settle in, but it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like victory. Jessica knew that this was just the beginning. Her brother's influence was powerful, yes, but the real work was just starting. The system that had allowed officers like Thompson to operate unchecked needed to change. And Jessica would be there, standing beside her brother, ensuring that it did. The car ride home was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine as David drove. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the passing streets, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of Officer Thompson's face when he realized who her brother was. The shock, the fear, the sudden understanding that the game had changed. It had felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but as the minutes ticked by, the gravity of what had just happened began to sink in. She wasn't just a victim of a wrongful arrest anymore. She was a part of something bigger. This was about more than just her. This was about the system, the one that had allowed people like Officer Thompson to act with impunity. It was broken, and today, she had taken the first step in fixing it. "You okay?" David's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to look at him. His expression was calm, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He had been in his element, confident and in control, but she knew that it wasn't just about fixing things for her. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. "I'm fine," Jessica replied, her voice steady. "It's just a lot to process. I never thought something like this would happen to me." David nodded, his eyes still focused on the road. "It's not just you," he said. "It happens to too many people every day, and it's not going to stop until we do something about it. What happened today, it's a small victory, but it's just the beginning." Jessica thought about that as they drove through the city. The streets seemed normal, people going about their day as if nothing had happened. But for Jessica, nothing was the same anymore. She had always known that the system was flawed, that people of color often faced obstacles that others didn't. But now, she had seen it firsthand, and she was determined to do something about it. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice quieter this time. David glanced over at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Now, we make sure the investigation goes through. We make sure the people who let this happen are held accountable. But it's not just about one officer. It's about making sure the whole system gets a wake-up call. We've got a long road ahead of us." Jessica nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It was going to be a long road, but for the first time, she felt like there was hope. As they pulled into the driveway, Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had been scared, humiliated, but she had made it through. And now, she had a purpose. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a force for change. "You know," David said as he shifted the car into park, "this isn't over. We'll be in the news. People will be watching. But that's a good thing. It means we have a platform now. A chance to change things." Jessica turned to face him, her heart swelling with a sense of determination she hadn't felt before. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's do it." The moment they stepped out of the car, Jessica's phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket and saw a message from her friend, Maya. "Are you okay? I saw the news. You're a hero." Jessica smiled, typing back quickly. "Just doing what's right." She turned to David, her eyes bright with resolve. "Let's make sure this never happens again." David placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We will. Together." The next few days were a whirlwind. The media picked up the story quickly, and soon, everyone was talking about Jessica's wrongful arrest and the involvement of her brother, the U.S. Attorney General. People from all walks of life reached out to her, offering support, sharing their own stories of injustice. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. Jessica realized that the power of her voice could make a difference. As the investigation into Officer Thompson began, David worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his position to ensure that justice was served. The truth came out, and Officer Thompson was held accountable for his actions. But Jessica knew this was just the beginning. The real work was in changing the system, in making sure that people who looked like her didn't have to face the same struggles every day. The fight for justice wasn't easy, but it was worth it, and she was ready to keep fighting. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice for those who didn't have one. She was part of the solution, and nothing would ever silence her again. It had been a week since Jessica's release, and the dust was slowly starting to settle. The investigation into Officer Thompson's actions was gaining momentum, and the media was still buzzing with the story of the wrongful arrest. But for Jessica, the attention, the interviews, and the constant flood of messages were starting to feel like a distant noise. She had already decided that this wasn't about the spotlight or the public recognition. This was about making real, lasting change. She sat in her living room, the light from the window casting a soft glow across the room. David had left early this morning, heading to meetings with colleagues in the Justice Department. He had been working around the clock, and Jessica could see the toll it was taking on him. But she understood. He had always been the one to fight the battles no one else would. And now, with this case, he had a chance to do more than just fight for her. He could change the entire system. Jessica stood up, walking over to the window. The streets outside were busy, cars rushing by, people walking with purpose. Everything seemed normal, as though nothing had happened, but she knew better. The world had shifted in small, but meaningful ways. The case had sparked something in her. It wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about the bigger picture, the systematic problems that allowed this to happen in the first place. It wasn't just Officer Thompson. It was the prejudices, the assumptions, the laws, and the people who turned a blind eye when things went wrong. She had spent the last few days reflecting on how far she had come. She had gone from being a victim, a face in the crowd, to a symbol of strength. Her name was on the news, and people were reaching out to thank her for her bravery. But she knew she couldn't stop here. She couldn't let this be the end. She had seen the impact of one person's voice. She had felt it herself. And now, she wanted to be the one who spoke for those who couldn't. She turned from the window, a sense of determination washing over her. She wasn't just going to stand by and watch things happen. She was going to make sure the system worked for everyone, not just the few who could afford to have their voices heard. That afternoon, Jessica sat down at her computer. The screen glowed softly in front of her as she opened up a blank document. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type. "It's time for change," she wrote. "It's time for us to stop being silent, to stop allowing injustice to take root in our communities. Every voice matters. Every story matters. It's time for us to stand together, to make sure this doesn't happen again." She paused for a moment, rereading the words. There was something in her that felt lighter, as if she was finally taking control of her own narrative. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was being proactive. She was going to make sure that people saw what she had seen, understood the power of one voice, and how it could ignite change. She hit send, and the post was live. She sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath. The decision had been made. She was going to use her platform to speak out. She was going to make sure the message didn't just fade away with time. And just as she was about to stand up, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Maya. "You did it, Jess. The world is listening." Jessica smiled. She didn't need the world's approval. She had the courage to stand up when it mattered. That was enough. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and press conferences. David's team was moving quickly, and the investigation into Officer Thompson was proceeding faster than anyone had expected. But the real work, the work Jessica had set out to do, was just beginning. She started working with local community leaders, activists, and organizations who were fighting for the same cause. Together, they started to build a platform for change, one that would speak not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Jessica doubted whether they would ever see the kind of systemic change they wanted. But every day, she saw the impact of their work. People were starting to speak up, share their stories, and stand alongside them. It wasn't just about police reform anymore. It was about giving everyone the opportunity to be heard, to be seen, and to be treated with dignity and respect. Jessica realized that this fight wasn't just for her or for the people she knew. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced. It was for every Black woman who had been wrongfully accused, for every person of color who had been unjustly treated by the system. The road ahead was long, but Jessica was no longer walking it alone. She had a team behind her, a community standing with her, and a voice that would not be ignored. She had become part of something bigger than herself, and she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But she also knew that change was possible, and she was determined to make it happen. The days continued to pass, but Jessica felt like she was living in a whirlwind. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. When she had first found herself in the back of that police car, she never could have imagined that the story would lead her here, working alongside her brother, David, and a team of passionate individuals dedicated to changing the system. The investigation into Officer Thompson was moving swiftly, but there were still challenges ahead. Jessica knew that the attention would eventually fade, that people would move on to the next big story. But she couldn't let that happen. This fight for justice couldn't be just another momentary trend. It had to be sustained. It had to keep going. Every conversation she had, every interview, every post she wrote, she made sure it carried the same message. Systemic change was possible, but only if everyone continued to push for it. She sat at her desk one morning, scrolling through the emails and messages that had piled up overnight. Many were supportive, from people who had heard her story and wanted to share their own. Others were from organizations reaching out to collaborate. There was still work to be done, and Jessica was more committed than ever. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a new message. It was from Maya, her close friend from college. "Hey Jess, just heard about the new bill they're introducing. It's got your name all over it. They want to make sure this never happens again. We need to talk." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She had heard whispers about legislation, about new policies being discussed, but seeing her name in the same sentence as change made it feel real. She quickly typed back, "Let's meet. I'm all in." The next day, Jessica and Maya met at a local coffee shop, a quiet place they often used to brainstorm. Maya was already sitting at a table when Jessica arrived, a laptop open in front of her. "I knew you'd come," Maya said with a grin, her eyes bright with excitement. "This bill is a game changer. They want to establish accountability standards for police officers, make sure wrongful arrests like yours are fully investigated, and ensure people of color aren't treated like criminals just because of the way they look." Jessica took a seat, her mind racing. She could hardly believe it. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about changing an entire system. "What's the next step?" Jessica asked, leaning forward. Maya clicked a few buttons on her laptop and turned the screen toward her. "They need advocates, people with real stories, people who have been through the system, to back this up. They want you to help push this through, to be the face of it." Jessica felt a mix of emotions. The thought of becoming the face of such a monumental change was humbling, but it also felt right. She had been through so much, and now she had the power to help shape the future. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, Jessica worked tirelessly with Maya and several other activists to help craft the bill. They met with lawmakers, gave interviews, and used their platforms to bring attention to the need for systemic reform. Every step of the way, Jessica could feel the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing every person who had ever been mistreated, every person who had ever been overlooked because of their race. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when it felt like the progress they were making wasn't enough. But Jessica had seen firsthand what could happen when people came together to fight for what was right. She knew they were on the right path. As the bill began to take shape, the media's focus on Jessica intensified. She was invited to speak at rallies, to participate in panels, and to be part of the conversation that was shaping the nation's views on justice. But even with all the attention, she remained focused on the end goal. This wasn't about fame or recognition. This was about making sure that no one else would ever have to go through what she had. The day the bill was finally introduced to Congress was a pivotal moment. Jessica stood alongside Maya and a group of other advocates, watching as the doors to change opened just a little wider. The press conference was packed, and cameras flashed as lawmakers took the stage. But all eyes were on Jessica, who was there to tell her story. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone with the same quiet strength that had carried her through everything else. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about every single person who has been wronged by a system that is supposed to protect us. It's time for us to stand up, to demand that our voices be heard, and to make sure that justice is truly blind, not just to the color of our skin, but to the power of our voices." The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It wasn't just for Jessica. It was for everyone who had ever fought for change, for everyone who had ever believed that things could be different. Jessica stood there, feeling the weight of what had been accomplished, but knowing there was still more to do. The fight for justice wasn't over, but with every step forward, they were getting closer to the world they all wanted to see. A world where everyone could be treated equally, where no one had to fear being unjustly targeted. And with every word spoken, every action taken, Jessica knew they were getting closer. This was just the beginning. The days that followed the press conference were a whirlwind of activity for Jessica. The world was watching, and the pressure was palpable, but Jessica was no longer the woman she had been before. She was different now, not just in her role as an advocate for justice, but in the way she carried herself. She walked with the confidence of someone who had seen the worst of what the system had to offer and had come out stronger for it. The bill she had supported was gaining traction, and she knew that her voice had made a difference. She had become a symbol for something greater than herself, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. But she was determined to see it through. As the weeks passed, Jessica worked tirelessly, meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and fellow activists who were just as committed to the cause as she was. She knew that the real fight was still ahead of them. The battle for true systemic change would not be easy, but it was one she was ready to take on. She spent long hours strategizing, discussing the future of the bill, and pushing for greater transparency within law enforcement. The media continued to follow her every move, but the attention was no longer a burden. Instead, It had become a tool, one that she used to bring attention to the systemic issues that had plagued society for far too long. One morning, as she sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates on the bill, her phone rang. It was Maya. "Jess, I just got word. The bill's about to be voted on in the Senate," Maya said, her voice filled with excitement. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. "This is it," Jessica whispered, more to herself than to Maya. "We've come so far." "We have," Maya replied. "But we're not done yet. You've got to be there. It's your moment." Jessica took a deep breath. It was her moment, yes, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had supported the cause, all the voices that had joined in the fight for justice. This was bigger than her. This was for everyone who had ever been wronged, for every person whose story had gone unheard. She could feel the weight of it all, but she also felt something else. Hope. They were on the cusp of something monumental. With the vote looming, Jessica prepared herself for what would come next. She knew that it wasn't guaranteed, that the fight wasn't over yet. But she also knew that they had already won something far more significant than a piece of legislation. They had sparked a movement, one that was just beginning to gain momentum. The day of the vote arrived, and Jessica stood with Maya and a small group of supporters outside the Capitol building. She watched as senators filed into the chambers, and the tension in the air was palpable. David was inside, working behind the scenes, doing everything he could to ensure the bill passed. Jessica had always admired his calm, his ability to remain composed under pressure, but today, she could feel the weight of it all. This was the moment that would determine whether the change they had fought for was real. As they waited, Jessica couldn't help but think back to the moment she had been arrested. How powerless she had felt, how much she had wished for someone to step in and make it right. Now, she was that someone. She had taken the first step, and it had led her here, to this moment, standing outside the halls of power, ready to see if all their hard work had been enough. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors of the Capitol opened, and David stepped out, his face serious but triumphant. The room fell silent as he approached Jessica. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. Jessica felt her heart swell with relief and gratitude. "You did it," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "We all did." The news spread quickly, and the nation erupted in a wave of support. The bill had passed. The victory was sweet, but Jessica knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time, she felt like they were on the right track. She had helped change the course of history, and she wasn't going to stop now. The journey ahead would be long, but Jessica was ready. She had seen firsthand what could be accomplished when people came together for a cause, when they used their voices to demand change. And she knew that the road to justice was one worth walking, no matter how difficult. As she stood on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, Jessica felt a sense of peace. She had come so far, but she knew that the work wasn't done. It would never be done until true equality was achieved. But as she looked around at the faces of those who had stood with her, she knew that they had made a difference. And that was something no one could take away. It had been a few months since the bill passed, and Jessica was back at work, but the sense of purpose she had found during the fight for justice had stayed with her. Her daily routine felt different now, charged with a sense of urgency that wasn't there before. The fight was far from over, but the momentum was growing. People were paying attention. The movement was alive, and Jessica knew that she couldn't let it die. She was no longer just the woman who had been wronged. She was a voice, a leader, someone who could make a real difference. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Maya. "I just heard back from the governor's office. They want to meet with you. They're pushing forward with a statewide reform plan, and they want you to be a part of it." Jessica's heart raced. It was exactly what she had been waiting for. The next step. "When and where?" she texted back. Maya responded quickly. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at the state capitol." Jessica looked at the clock on the wall. She had less than 24 hours to prepare. She took a deep breath. She had come so far, and now, the chance to influence even more change was within her reach. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the Capitol, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. She had been here before, but this time, it was different. She wasn't just a visitor. She was a part of the process. She was at the table, and the decisions being made would affect countless lives. As she walked into the meeting room, She saw a group of people already gathered, lawmakers, community leaders, and activists who had been part of the movement. There was a buzz of conversation as they discussed the next phase of reform. Jessica took a seat at the head of the table, her mind racing with possibilities. "Thank you for joining us today," the governor said as he stood at the front of the room. "We are here to discuss how we can build on the momentum from the recent bill and take it further. We have a chance to set a national precedent. We want to make sure that the voices of people who have been affected by this system are heard loud and clear." Jessica's heart swelled as she realized the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about one law, one policy, or one state. This was about creating a model for the rest of the country to follow. They were shaping history, and Jessica was at the center of it all. "We need someone who can speak to the real impact of these policies," the governor continued, his eyes landing on Jessica. "We need someone who can represent the people. You've already done so much, Jessica, and now we're asking you to help guide this reform from the inside." She felt the weight of his words. It was a huge responsibility, but it was one she was ready for. She looked around the room at the faces of those who had fought beside her, and she nodded. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. The meeting was filled with strategic discussions, drafting new policies, and deciding how they would approach the next steps. The reform was expansive, covering everything from police accountability to racial profiling and community policing. Jessica knew this was just the beginning. The work was only going to get harder from here, but she was ready. As the meeting wrapped up, the governor turned to Jessica and said, "You've been a game changer, Jessica. Your courage has sparked something powerful, and now it's time to push it even further." "I'm just getting started," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. Walking out of the Capitol, Jessica felt the weight of everything they had accomplished and everything that was still to come. The real work was just beginning, but she was ready to face it. With the momentum of the bill behind them, they had the chance to change the entire system. And Jessica knew that no matter what came next, she would never back down. This was her mission, her fight, and she would see it through to the end. The road ahead would be long, but the light at the end was getting brighter. Together, they were building something that could last, something that would change the world for the better. And Jessica was proud to be part of it. It had been weeks since Jessica stood in that room at the Capitol, and the momentum of the reform had not slowed. The policies were being drafted, the lawmakers were working tirelessly, and the public's attention was still on the movement. Jessica had become more than just a voice for justice. She was now part of the machinery driving that change, and every day felt like another step forward. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for every person whose voice had been silenced, and for every community that had been overlooked by a broken system. But despite the progress they had made, Jessica knew that the hardest work was still ahead. She couldn't afford to let the movement lose steam. The road to real, lasting change was long, and she was determined to stay the course. Late one evening, as Jessica was going through emails and preparing for an upcoming press conference, she received a call. It was David. "Jess," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk. There's something coming up, and we have to be ready for it." Jessica's stomach tightened. She had learned to recognize the tone in David's voice. It was the same tone he used when they were preparing for something big, something that would shift the direction of their efforts. "What's going on?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "There's going to be a major hearing next week," David explained. "It's going to focus on law enforcement practices, but we need to make sure our voices are heard. This is our chance to push for the reforms we've been working on." Jessica's heart raced. The hearing could be a game changer. It would bring together lawmakers, experts, and activists, and the spotlight would be on them. This was their opportunity to push their agenda forward, to make sure the changes they had fought so hard for were implemented. "I'll be there," Jessica said, her resolve solidifying. "What do we need to do?" "We need to be prepared," David replied. "We'll need testimony from you, from Maya, from other leaders in the movement. It's going to be intense, but we can't afford to back down now." Jessica agreed, feeling the weight of the moment. This hearing was their chance to truly make their voices heard, to stand up in front of those in power and demand that things change. The following week, the day of the hearing arrived, and Jessica felt the familiar tension in the air. She arrived at the Capitol early, joining Maya and other activists who had been preparing for this moment. They went over their talking points one last time, making sure every word was chosen carefully. This wasn't just about speaking their truth. It was about ensuring that their message would be heard by those who had the power to make real changes. As the hearing began, Jessica sat in the front row, watching as the lawmakers and experts spoke. She could feel the weight of their words, the urgency of the moment. But when it was her turn to speak, she felt a calm come over her. She had been in this position before, speaking out for justice, but this was different. This time, she wasn't just asking for change. She was demanding it. She stood and walked up to the witness table, her posture strong, her heart steady. "Thank you for allowing me to speak today," Jessica began, her voice clear and confident. "We are here because we have been wronged. We are here because we have been silenced. We are here because our communities, our families, our lives matter. And we will not be ignored any longer." The room was silent as Jessica's words echoed through the chambers. She could feel the eyes of the lawmakers on her, their attention fully on her. "This is not just about one bill," she continued. "This is about a system that has failed us for far too long. A system that has treated people like me, people who look like me, as less than. And it's time for that to end. We are not asking for mercy. We are demanding justice. We are demanding equality." As she spoke, Jessica could see the faces in the room shift. Some were nodding in agreement. Others seemed uncomfortable, but they were listening. For the first time, she felt like her voice was not just heard. It was being taken seriously. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, before a round of applause broke out. Jessica didn't need the applause. What mattered was the message had been delivered. What mattered was that the fight for justice was no longer something that could be ignored. Later that evening, as Jessica left the Capitol, she felt a sense of accomplishment, but she also knew that there was still so much work to be done. The hearing had been a success, but the real change would come when the reforms they had been pushing for were enacted. And that was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. No one was. There was still more to fight for, and Jessica was ready. Ready to stand up. Ready to speak out. Ready to make sure that the justice they had been fighting for wasn't just a dream, but a reality. The weeks following the hearing were a whirlwind of activity for Jessica. The momentum from the testimony she had delivered carried through the halls of Congress, and the media continued to shine a spotlight on the fight for justice. Her inbox was filled with messages from both supporters and skeptics. Some people praised her for her courage, for speaking out on behalf of those who had been unheard for far too long. Others criticized her, questioning the validity of the reforms and the true impact of the bill. But Jessica didn't let the negative voices drown out the positive ones. She had learned to tune out the noise and focus on what mattered. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. She had become a symbol, not just for those who supported her, but for everyone who believed in the promise of a fair and just society. Her role had grown far beyond that of an advocate. She was now a leader, someone whose actions had begun to inspire others to step up and fight for change in their own communities. Late one afternoon, as Jessica was sitting in her office, reflecting on the progress they had made, her phone buzzed. It was David. "We need to talk," he said, his voice serious. "There's something coming up that requires your attention." Jessica sat up straight, immediately feeling the weight of his words. She had learned to trust her brother's judgment, and when he said something was important, it was. "What's going on?" she asked. "There's a push for federal-level reform," David explained. "But we need strong voices, people who are in the trenches, to make sure it gets passed. The administration's willing to back the bill, but we need the grassroots support to push it through. I want you to be a part of the task force." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. A federal-level reform. This was what she had been working for all along. The chance to take everything they had accomplished at the state level and push it to a national scale. It was the next step in the movement they had started together. "When do we start?" she asked, already preparing herself for the work ahead. "Tomorrow morning," David replied. "We have a meeting with the task force. I'll brief you then." The next day, Jessica walked into the meeting room with a sense of purpose. She was surrounded by people who had been fighting for change just as long as she had. Lawmakers, activists, and community leaders. As she took her seat, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was it. They were about to tackle the very system that had failed so many for so long. The discussion began with a review of the progress they had made in the past few months. The bill had already gained significant traction in the Senate, and now they were working to refine it, to make sure it would stand up to any legal challenges it might face. But it wasn't just about making sure the bill passed. It was about creating a lasting impact. They were talking about policies that would reshape the way law enforcement operated across the country. Jessica listened closely as the room filled with voices, each one bringing a different perspective. Some talked about the need for stronger accountability measures for police officers. Others spoke about addressing the root causes of systemic racism within law enforcement. Jessica knew that each point raised was crucial and that the changes they were discussing would affect countless lives. She wasn't just there to speak. She was there to listen, to learn, and to contribute her voice to the conversation. As the meeting progressed, Jessica found herself growing more and more energized. This was what she had been working for. This was the reason she had fought so hard to bring attention to the issue. She could feel the power of the collective effort in the room. This wasn't just about one person, one bill, or one movement. This was about a national change, a shift in how the country viewed and treated its most marginalized communities. By the end of the meeting, Jessica had a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the work ahead would be difficult, but she was more than ready. This was her moment. This was the moment to take everything she had learned and fought for and push it to the next level. As the meeting concluded and everyone began to file out of the room, Jessica found herself standing at the front, talking to one of the other task force members. They were discussing strategies for engaging the public, for making sure that the bill had the grassroots support it needed to succeed. "We need to make sure this is a movement, not just a bill," Jessica said, her voice filled with conviction. "The people need to see that this is about them, that this is about their lives and their futures." The other member nodded. "You're right. We have to make sure this is something everyone can get behind, not just a policy, but a movement, something people can believe in." Jessica smiled, knowing that she had just found her next challenge. The task force had a long road ahead of them, but she was ready for it. She was more committed than ever to making sure the reform went beyond just a set of laws. It had to be about changing hearts and minds, about making sure the work they were doing would last long after the bill was passed. As Jessica left the Capitol that evening, she felt the weight of everything they had accomplished and everything still left to do. The road ahead was long, but she was no longer walking it alone. She had a team, a movement, and a voice that could no longer be silenced. And she knew, without a doubt, that change was coming. Slowly, but surely, the system was beginning to shift, and she was going to make sure it kept moving forward. The weeks following the task force meeting were a blur of activity. Jessica was more determined than ever to ensure that the reform they had been working towards would not only be passed, but also implemented with real impact. She was in constant communication with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders, making sure that every voice was heard and that no detail was overlooked. But despite all the progress, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was still full of challenges. The deeper she delved into the complexities of systemic change, the more she realized just how entrenched the problems were. It wasn't just about passing a bill. It was about dismantling an entire system that had been built over centuries. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but Jessica felt ready to carry it. She knew that this fight was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. It was about the future of her community, the future of all those who had been silenced and oppressed for far too long. One morning, Jessica woke up to a flurry of messages. The bill had reached a critical point. There were reports that it would be voted on in the Senate within the next week. The pressure was mounting, but Jessica refused to back down. She quickly arranged a meeting with David and Maya to strategize their next steps. "This is it," Jessica said, pacing in the conference room, her hands clasped in front of her. "We fought so hard to get here. Now, we need to make sure it passes." David nodded, his face serious. "We need to keep the pressure on. We need to get the public involved more than ever. We've made a lot of progress, but we can't let up now." Maya chimed in. "We've got a lot of support from grassroots organizations, but we need to remind people why this matters. This is about their communities, their children, their future." Jessica looked at both of them, her resolve strengthening. "I'll do whatever it takes. Let's make sure they understand what's at stake." They spent the next few days working around the clock, calling supporters, meeting with local leaders, and preparing for the inevitable media storm. The countdown to the vote had begun, and every moment felt like it could make the difference. The day before the vote, Jessica stood before a crowd of supporters outside the Capitol. The air was crisp, and the energy in the crowd was palpable. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for, but it wasn't over yet. The battle wasn't won until the vote was cast. As she took the microphone, the crowd fell silent, their attention fixed on her. "This fight is about more than just a bill," Jessica began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about all of us. It's about every single person who has ever been discriminated against, every person who has ever been wronged by a system that was never meant to serve them. It's about our communities, our families, and our futures. And we will not stop fighting until justice is served." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jessica felt a surge of energy. This was why they were doing this. This was the moment they had been waiting for. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked, for every person who had ever been dismissed because of the color of their skin. The next day, the vote began. Jessica, David, and Maya sat in a room just off the Senate floor, waiting for the results. The tension was palpable. It was a moment of uncertainty, but Jessica knew they had done everything they could. They had put in the work, they had spoken their truth, and now it was out of their hands. Hours seemed to stretch on as the vote continued. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, the doors opened, and the results were announced. The bill had passed. A wave of relief washed over Jessica, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of responsibility. The work wasn't over. This was just the beginning. As she stood in the Senate chamber, surrounded by the people who had fought alongside her, Jessica felt a sense of pride, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they still had to ensure the reforms were fully implemented. The victory was important, but the real change would come when the systems that had perpetuated inequality were dismantled, piece by piece. "We did it," David said, his voice filled with pride. "But we're just getting started." Jessica nodded, her eyes focused on the future. The fight for justice was never truly over, but this victory was a step toward something better. A step toward a future where everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with dignity and respect. It had been a long road, but Jessica knew that the real work was just beginning. She had taken the first step, but now it was time to take the next one. With the support of her community, her family, and her brother by her side, Jessica was ready to face whatever came next. The road to justice was long, but they were on the right path, and Jessica would continue to fight until it was truly achieved. The days after the bill passed were a mixture of celebration and hard work. Jessica felt the weight of what they had accomplished, but the reality of the ongoing fight for justice settled in quickly. The victory was monumental, but the reforms they had worked for were just the beginning. She spent the following weeks working closely with local leaders, organizing community forums, and speaking at rallies, making sure that the changes they had fought for would be fully implemented. Jessica knew that while the law was important, real change would only happen when it reached the people, when communities were actively involved in shaping the future. One evening, as she sat in her office, looking over the latest reports, her phone rang. It was David. "Hey, Jess, we need to talk." "There's something big coming up," he said, his voice carrying a hint of urgency. Jessica sat up straight, her attention fully on her brother's words. "What's going on?" "There's a proposal for another piece of legislation that could help further the reforms, but it's facing some strong opposition. I need your help to rally the community behind it." Jessica's heart raced. This was another opportunity to push the movement forward, but it wouldn't be easy. She had seen the resistance to change before, and she knew it wasn't just about passing laws. It was about making sure the people who stood to benefit from those laws understood how important it was to push for more. "I'm in," Jessica said without hesitation. "What's the plan?" David explained that they would need to get the public on board quickly. The opposition was powerful, and they needed every voice they could get. Over the next few days, Jessica threw herself into the work. She traveled across the state, speaking to communities, attending town halls, and meeting with activists. She knew that if they were going to make a difference, they would need to engage with the people who had been most affected by the system. She spent long hours listening to stories of injustice, stories that reminded her why she had started this fight in the first place. Each story reinforced her belief that real change was possible, and she was determined to make sure that change was felt by everyone. At one of the rallies, as Jessica spoke about the importance of supporting the new legislation, the crowd was electric. People were holding signs, chanting, and cheering, But it was the faces in the crowd that mattered most to her. The people who had stood on the sidelines for so long were now stepping up, and she could see the power in their voices. "This is about our future," she told the crowd, her voice strong. "This is about our children, our communities, our families. We cannot afford to let the system stay the way it is. We need to stand up and make our voices heard, and we need to do it now." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jessica felt the energy shift. They weren't just advocating for a bill anymore. They were advocating for themselves, for their right to live in a just and equitable society. After the rally, Jessica spoke with a group of young activists who had been part of the event. They were eager to continue the fight, and their passion reminded Jessica why this movement was so powerful. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the generations to come. That night, as Jessica reflected on the rally and the momentum building behind the movement, she knew they were at a turning point. The work was hard, the opposition was fierce, but they were making progress. Every rally, every conversation, every protest brought them closer to the change they needed. As the days passed, the support for the new legislation continued to grow. People were starting to realize that they had the power to shape their own future. They weren't going to wait for someone else to fix things, they were going to do it themselves. When the day of the vote came, Jessica stood with David in the Capitol building, waiting for the results. The tension was thick, but Jessica's confidence had grown since the last time she had been here. This time, they had a united front. This time, the people were behind them. The vote passed. Another victory. But Jessica knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for justice didn't end with one law, one bill, or one reform. It was a continuous effort, a commitment to pushing for more, for better. As she stood in the Capitol, hearing the cheers of supporters in the background, Jessica felt a deep sense of pride. They had done it. The movement was gaining the momentum it needed to make real, lasting change. And as long as she was able, she would continue to fight for it. Because, for Jessica, this wasn't just a political fight. It was a fight for her community, her family, and the future of her country. She had started as one voice, but now she was part of a chorus, a movement that would not be silenced. The road was long, and there was still much to be done, but Jessica was ready. She had seen firsthand what could be achieved when people came together to demand change. And she knew that this was just the beginning. The weeks following the passage of the latest legislation were a blur of meetings, community events, and continued outreach. Jessica had become a cornerstone of the movement for justice, her voice not only heard but amplified. She spent much of her time working alongside lawmakers, activists, and community organizers, pushing for the reforms that had been promised and ensuring that they would be fully implemented. But despite the victories they had achieved, Jessica knew that the real work was still ahead of them. She had seen firsthand how difficult it could be to change a system that had been entrenched for so long. But she also knew that the momentum they had built was too powerful to ignore. It was early one morning when Jessica received a call from Maya. "We've got something big," Maya said, her voice full of excitement. "The president's office has reached out. They want to meet with you." Jessica's pulse quickened. The president. The conversation she had dreamed of but never imagined would actually happen. "What's this about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're looking at you to lead a national campaign for police reform," Maya explained. "They need someone with your experience, your voice, to help lead the charge. They're offering a seat at the table, Jess. This is the moment we've been working for." Jessica's heart raced. She had spent so many years pushing for justice, advocating for systemic change, and now, the opportunity to take it to the highest level had arrived. She wasn't sure whether to feel excited, overwhelmed, or a mix of both. "I'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. "I'll meet with them." The next day, Jessica found herself standing outside the White House, her heart pounding as she prepared to walk inside for what could be the most important meeting of her life. The stakes were higher than ever. The entire country was watching, and she knew that whatever happened here would shape the future of police reform for generations to come. As she walked into the meeting room, Jessica was greeted by a small group of the president's advisors, including key members of the Justice Department. They all stood and shook her hand, their faces serious but welcoming. The atmosphere in the room was charged with the weight of what was at stake. "Thank you for coming, Jessica," the president's chief of staff said. "We've been following your work closely, and and we believe you have the leadership and the vision to help us push this reform forward on a national scale." Jessica nodded, trying to remain calm despite the gravity of the moment. "I'm honored to be here," she said. "This is a fight I've been in for a long time, and I believe we're on the verge of something that can change this country for the better. But I won't do it alone. It has to be a collective effort." The room fell silent for a moment as the words sank in. Jessica wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every community, every person who had been hurt by the system. She wasn't just advocating for change. She was fighting for the future of the country. "We understand that," the chief of staff said, his voice steady. "And we're committed to working with you. We need your input, your guidance, and your leadership to ensure that this reform has the support it needs to succeed." As they continued to discuss the details of the national campaign, Jessica felt the weight of the responsibility she was taking on. But she also felt something else: hope. She had seen so many people struggle, so many lives impacted by a system that had failed them. And now, she had the chance to make sure that wasn't the case anymore. As the meeting concluded, Jessica stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just there to speak on behalf of a movement. She was there to shape its future. "Let's make this happen," she said, her voice firm with determination. "The work isn't done yet, and we still have a long way to go. But we've got this." As she left the White House that day, Jessica couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The fight was far from over, but it was clear that they were headed in the right direction. She had come so far, and now, with the support of the highest levels of government, the work she had started was about to reach even greater heights. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jessica knew that with every step, they were getting closer to real, lasting change. She had started as one voice, but now, she was part of something much bigger, and she was ready to keep fighting until justice was not just a dream, but a reality for everyone.